Alright, AMP1 students, in this video we're in chapter 3 and we're going to continue with it and we're going to start talking about chemical reactions. So let me show you on the objectives. So number 6, 7, we'll probably talk about 8 and 9 here too. So these are the objectives that we're going to talk about that pertain to chemical reactions. So let me go back to our textbook. Alright, so realize that in the human body, there's millions of chemical reactions that are going on all the time. So we're essentially kind of a walking chemistry lab because there's all kinds of chemical reactions going on every second of every minute of every day. So we had this question on the exam 1 that we had. The name for that, kind of like a general name to describe, kind of all of the chemical reactions that are occurring in our bodies, we call it metabolism. So that is our metabolism. So when we say chemical reaction, what we're talking about is whenever chemical bonds are broken and then other chemical bonds are formed, and so whenever those things happen, we can make new structures or molecules. And so that's what happens in a chemical reaction. That's kind of the definition of it. Whenever chemical bonds in a molecule are broken and then new ones are formed, and then you get this whole new product or molecule from that. So we need to be familiar with the common types of chemical reactions that happen in the human body. And we will learn about some of those chemical reactions as we go through AMP1. So it's important to know what we mean when we say that, this particular molecule was decomposed or synthesized. It's good to know that terminology, so when we talk about the body processes, it'll make a little bit more sense. Okay, so there's some kind of simple terms that you probably are familiar with. Reactants and products are terms, so just realize that anytime we have any molecule or molecules before a reaction, we call those the reactants, and then if we have the new molecule that's formed after the reaction, we call it the product. So reactants and products are the terms that we'll use as well when we're talking about a chemical reaction. So this gives you, they'll use like A and B. A is one reactant, B is another reactant. In this case, it looks like they're going to form a bond together. And then when they do that, they're going to kind of change their structure or molecule, and then they'll produce a reactant, like a different molecule, and we'll call that C. So that's just kind of a generic way to represent it. And then this is showing calcium, the ion, forming a ionic bond with chloride. And so this is your two reactants, and then you get this one product that's different than the two reactants. So, all right, so I'm going to slide down here to our classes of chemical reactions, or types of chemical reactions that you should be familiar with. So the first one we'll talk about is called a decomposition reaction. So anytime we have a molecule in the body, and it's usually a pretty large molecule that's in the body, and we break it down into smaller molecules, so bonds are broken, and then we get these smaller molecules, we call that a decomposition reaction. So this is showing a chemical reaction, and this would be like an example of a chemical reaction that happens in our intestines. So sucrose is table sugar. So let's say that we eat some table sugar or something with sugar, table sugar in it. So this is what the sucrose molecule looks like. So it has these two sugar molecules. Each one of those is a sugar molecule, and they have a bond together. So whenever that enters our intestines, then what will happen to it is it'll get digested or broken down or decomposed. used. And so that means that this bond will be broken. And when that happens, then we get these, so this was our reactant, and then what we get is two products. So we'll get the glucose product and then the fructose product from that decomposition reaction. So this is a pretty common reaction in our digestive systems because we're taking in big, large molecules that are nutrients, and we need to break them down or digest them, decompose them into smaller ones, so that way we can use them. They're too big in this form. So that's pretty common thing going on within our digestive system. It's happening elsewhere too, but that's a example of a common place that happens. All right, so that's decomposition reaction. The opposite of that is called a synthesis reaction. So that's whenever you have two smaller molecules or atoms or ions, and then they form bonds together and form a larger molecule or structure. So an example that was used here was amino acids. Remember, those are the building blocks of proteins. So if we have an amino acid here, an amino acid here, those are our reactants, and then we form a bond between them. Then we get a larger molecule here. They call it a dipeptide. So we get a larger molecule. So, and this would be our product. So this is a pretty common reaction that happens in our cells that are making proteins. So like our red blood cells, they make hemoglobin. That's a protein. So this reaction is going on. Obviously the hemoglobin protein is much, much bigger than just two amino acids. So this little synthesis reaction would have to happen over and over again to finally get a very large protein molecule. And other bonds would have to be formed to allow that protein to kind of fold into its proper shape. Other proteins like actin and myosin are the two kind of main proteins in our muscles that are involved in contracting, or the contraction process. So those cells would be bonding amino acids together to make those proteins as well. So any cells that are making, and I'm using proteins as an example, but it could be any molecule that needs to be made by it, whether it's a hormone or melanin, anything like that. It's going to go through a synthesis reaction. All right, and then our third type of chemical reaction, it's kind of like a combination of decomposition and synthesis. They call it an exchange reaction, though, because what happens is one bond is broken and a molecule or a atom, something's released. So that's kind of the decomposition part. And then what happens is the part that was released, it'll form a bond with another molecule. So here's our two reactant molecules, and this little phosphate, the bond was broken, so that's decomposition, and then that phosphate was bonded to this ADP molecule to make ATP. So that's the synthesis part because we formed a bond. And so then we get two different products here through that process. So those are called exchange reactions. So it's just kind of whenever one molecule gives up an atom or part of itself to another molecule, and then you get two different products from that. All right, so those are our chemical reactions, and now the three types that you should be familiar with. And now we'll talk about activation energy and kind of define an enzyme. So at the very bottom here, we have a nice little description of activation energy. So those chemical reactions that we were looking at up here, go back up here, they will require energy in order to happen. So, and they all kind of vary on how much energy they need for it to happen. So we call that the activation energy of a chemical reaction. So just the energy required to, like break bonds so that a chemical reaction can proceed. So we call it the activation energy. So there's some energy input into a chemical reaction. All right. So the thing about activation energy is we need to make sure that the activation energy is sufficient to overcome, not the activation energy, sorry, that we have enough energy to overcome that activation energy, so that way we can get those chemical bonds broken. So a lot of times, if you're working in the laboratory setting, you would just heat something up. If you heat something up, that is going to cause all those molecules or atoms to move a lot faster and bump into each other, and then that could provide the sufficient energy to overcome the activation energy, and you can get a breaking of the bonds. But we can't do that in the human body. We can't like heat our human body up, because remember, one of the reasons is if our body temperature gets too high, our proteins within the body, they denature, they break down, they can't function, and pretty much halts all processes in the body. So that's not a good way to make a chemical reaction happen. And so the molecule that the human body uses to get that chemical reactions to happen so that they have sufficient energy to overcome that activation energy is enzymes. Yeah, so these little enzymes, and that's what our next video is going to be over, is just the enzymes and their basic information, how they work and why they work. So enzymes are they call them, there's a lot of different terms for them, but they are proteins, and they catalyze. That's usually the term we use. You could also say speeds up, lowers the activation energy. Those are all kind of things you could say for enzymes. But what they're there for is to make chemical reactions happen. So they catalyze chemical reactions or speed them up, make them happen. And so they're basically the only reason that all our chemical reactions are happening in a timely manner to maintain our body functions and keep us alive. So, alright, so in the next video we'll talk a lot more detail about our enzymes, since they're vital for our chemical reactions to happen, which are vital for our body functions to happen. So I'll see you in the next video.